Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I was just telling Oliver I'm trying to have a more relaxed tone of voice whenever I start the episodes, because every time I listen to myself back, I sound a little bit too enthusiastic, and it's been really getting to me. So hopefully that was a lot more relaxing for you all. Welcome to our episode 6. It's sort of like a Halloween edition episode because we are going to be talking about blood composition and it's a little spooky. So happy Halloween. Speaking of Halloween, since I got off from work, I've been carving a pumpkin for my lab's pumpkin carving contest. And for those who cannot see, it is
Ooh.
very elaborate because anything that I do, I'm going to do it fully elaborate. And it has a big hand pipetting, and it has a lady screaming, and a ghost, and it says, "Oh no, the lab is haunted." And then at the bottom it says, "The ghost left the R10 out." And it's funny because I'm definitely the ghost. I'm always the one accidentally leaving things out, accidentally leaving lights on. So that's kind of the joke.
That was one of the most conceptually elaborate pumpkins I've ever seen. I mean, like, there was full, like, shading on the areas you're going to carve out. So I feel like just... No, that's a top 3 at the very least, if not number 1.
I know that $50 cash prize has my name.
Also, how many
written
people
on
are
it.
even in there in a lab pumpkin carving competition? Like, is it even that big of a lab to begin with?
Well, it's the full research center. It's not just my
Okay.
lab. So it's actually a lot of people. I think that maybe like 10 or 15 people participate every year. I'm not exactly sure. This will be my first year doing it, but I'm very excited.
Well, fingers crossed.
Today, our episode 6 is called Salt, Blood, Conductivity, and Culture. We've had this in the books for a while now, so we're very excited. And before I move on, I do want to thank you all. We've reached about 30 followers now. We have consistent people listening to every episode. We have people coming to our website every day. We are so grateful for that. Since we've grown, I've learned so much about the people watching. I've gotten to meet so many different people. And as always, if you want to give any feedback or ask any questions about our content, please contact us at media@octorum.com. That's our email. We'll message you back and maybe even feature your question or comment on our next episode.
In that vein of engagement, I would like to add that I am proud to report that we have a review on Spotify, a whopping
Yes.
5-star review, unchallenged. So either continue to rate us 5 stars or say nothing.
And I hope that you know whoever rated us 5 stars, I cried tears at work.
You cried tears?
I was so happy. I was having a hard day and it really, yes, I did. It really, really warmed my heart. So thank you. Yeah. Today, we're going to be discussing salt in biology, particularly NaCl, sodium chloride, table salt, whatever you want to call it, not to be confused with the broader category of molecules known as salts, which are positive and negative ions that produce a net zero charge. In this episode, we were inspired by the long discussed topic of how the composition of blood, specifically plasma, and the fluid inside of our cells has been thought to be very similar to the composition of seawater. We'll be discussing the validity of this theory based on scientific evidence, as well as the significance of salt on human culture, human health, and the origins of life.
Yeah. One of the things that I hope will emerge with or take into this episode is just complicating the human relationship with salt as a whole. Because, like, if you think about it immediately just in terms of diet, there does feel like this paradoxical relationship with salt where there's a sense of craving, the sense of we need it in our diet. There's, like, we're craving salty foods along with all the fats and stuff. But then all that is commonly thrown into this category of like, no, we're having too much salt now. There's too much sodium. It's like we need to avoid it. So it feels like we're, as a species or just as people, already have a kind of complicated, we want it but we can't have it relationship with salt. And usually that's just kind of attributed to, diet control. You have to control your salt cravings and stuff. But I think what could be cool here is seeing how there is almost like an evolutionary or biological basis for our complicated relationship with salt.
Exactly. And we've also developed a lot of hypotheses as to our connection with our environment. And like I mentioned before, one of those hypotheses has been our connection to the sea and sort of this overlap in salt. And so I think that this will be a really interesting discussion that also explores the way that we see ourselves within the environment a little bit as well. But to talk about where this podcast episode came from for me, about a year ago, I discovered a book titled Cancer and the New Biology of Water by Thomas Cowan, MD, who has written many books about alternative medicine. And in short, this book focuses on the cytoplasm of cells and how disruption of cellular equilibrium can potentially contribute to cancer. All in all, I want to clarify that I enjoy reading all perspectives. Even if I disagree with someone's reasoning or take on something, I rarely ever feel like my time is wasted. When it comes to people's perspectives on science, I think it's less about opinions and more about where the evidence leads, which is why I think it's important to educate yourself not just on the headlines of science, but truly the mechanisms behind them, so that if a theory is proposed, you can understand the legitimacy of it and not just accept something at face value. All in all, I did not think that this book was scientifically accurate, but I always appreciate learning new theories and historical tidbits of science. And one thing that this book discussed was the development of the first concept of IV fluids by René Joseph Quinton in 1897. Quinton was a French scientist who noted the seemingly similar composition of seawater and blood, and at the time also did IV transfusions of seawater. Despite lots of current advertising that you can find from wellness stores and supplement sites, Quinton was not successful, despite his theory being very interesting and worthy of future research. The animals that he experimented on with seawater infusion were alleged to survive, but modern science has debunked this idea that seawater can be a replacement for blood. True or not, I still find the connection between seawater and blood/bodily fluids to be a very interesting discussion to have, and I'm specifically interested in the salt component of this. Our approach here is to use evidence-based literature to unpack this relationship.
This kind of exists more on like a pop culture level than more kind of like a scientific level. There have been people engaging with it on that way, but it doesn't make sense to engage it with that way. Yeah, it feels like from our perspective now, it would be easy to say, of course, if you inject salt water directly into the veins of an animal, it would end up dying. And even if it is in that boat of just, oh, it didn't die immediately, even now we could say, yeah, if I chug a gallon of seawater right now, it won't kill me immediately, but that doesn't mean it's going to be good for me either.
Actually, if you chugged a gallon of seawater, you probably would die pretty instantaneously.
Instantaneously?
Like within a day.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, within a day. Oh, that doesn't feel like instantaneously to me. Or no. I'm just trying to elaborate on, I don't know.
I get
was
what
just
you're
trying to
saying,
build
though.
on just proof of concept of I put salt water in a dog and it didn't die is just kind of like, that's not really saying anything. That's just what I was trying to get
and
at.
it did die. Like, that's also the other funny thing. They did die. But it was like 5 days later or something. And so he just, said that in the short term it was successful. Our first paper is titled The Paleochemistry of Body Fluids and Tissues, written by A.B. McCallum and published in Physiological Reviews in 1926. The subject of paleochemistry itself is a wildly cool topic. The Oxford Dictionary definition of paleochemistry is the study of chemical composition of ancient materials or environments. This field involves analyzing the chemical properties of fossils and ancient sediments to understand past environmental conditions and processes. This paper specifically approaches blood plasma and cytoplasm as an artifact for analysis to determine past environmental conditions and processes of humans and cells. So this is really cool because it isn't just studying rocks and non-living things. You're actually using biology as the artifact to determine what could the potential ancient environment be. Of course, this process requires making the assumption that the inner environment of cells is an artifact for ancient environments, and that's dependent on the theory that the inner and outer environments were once equal before cells developed membranes that would maintain a desired concentration. And this makes sense. But of course, I say this to emphasize that sometimes scientific theories are like dominoes, where they represent layers of foundational assumptions that must be made to continue a linear line of inquiry. But let's play with it. In McCallum's paleochemistry paper, he recaps the older theories on the topic, such as the theory from Hans Peter Bunge's belief from 1889 that sodium chloride, NaCl, content in vertebrate tissues and blood is evidence of marine ancestors. He also discusses that the previously mentioned works of Quinton from 1897, in which Quinton hypothesized that blood composition was essentially an artifact of ancient seawater. It was these two theories that supported this narrative of humans craving for salt. They believe that since pre-human ancestors were once sea forms, and the sea was so high in salt, sodium chloride, that human tissues were accustomed to high salt concentration, leading to a relationship of constantly seeking salt. To explore this further, we found some humanities articles that detail the culture and human relationship of salt. One paper called The Social Influence of Salt, published in the Scientific American by M.R. Block in 1963, explores this. He writes, open quote, "For want of salt, men have risked their lives and endured the most disagreeable circumstances. Over large areas of Africa, lacking other sources, people used to drink the urine of animals for its salt." End quote. He details the physiological need for salt to regulate blood levels, as salt is excreted and lost through urine and sweat, but is needed to regulate blood pressure and thirst. Historically, salt was obtained through fish and meat, as their tissues had adequate salt. For areas where vegetation was the main source of food, Block writes about communities drinking blood and urine from animals to supplement salt intake. Salt was also used as a tool to preserve meat. Historically, salt was procured using salt pans, where the water in seawater was evaporated, leaving only the salt behind. Salt drove the development of trade routes and allowed for the development of civilizations, ultimately impacting political patterns as well. There seems to be an intense connection with salt, blood, and culture. So, how can McCallum's research bring us deeper into this? Are we truly constantly trying to return to the salty state of our marine ancestors?
What I really love about the McCallum paper is that it really is a fusion of three different disciplines that you don't really see overlapping too much: culture, or the more humanities side of it, the chemistry of it, and then the more cell evolutionary theory side of it. When you hold them all up next to each other, you see there are connections that you can make that you normally couldn't make by bringing in that interdisciplinary thought. And again, we can answer these cultural questions with chemistry questions, and then they can all just inform each other.
Yeah, and honestly, that's why I loved this paleochemistry take in the first place. The idea of looking at biology, whether it's cells, tissues, or honestly, like you can even approach culture this way and look at it from a societal scale, but looking at biology as an artifact of the natural world. And then saying, okay, using this artifact, what could we determine about the ancient environment based on what we have here? And so in this paper, he's using the actual chemistry and composition of blood and of bodily fluids. But, sort of in the intellectual play that I went through whenever I was reading this paper, I did wonder, like, what would be some other ways that we could do this? What else could we observe based upon a foundational idea that we can observe an artifact and look within the artifact to determine the ancient environment?
Another little thing that I want to mention about this paper is that despite how contemporary or new ground this feels, this is a 1926 paper, so nearly a century old, which is a crazy thing to think about. Just kind of like somebody in the 20th century was having this conversation, making these connections. And I think that's kind of like one of the fun things to see in science, especially when you are doing literature reviews. Of the vast majority of the time, you are working with stuff that, you have professors or research advisors that say, I don't want to see anything more than a decade old. because of just how much contemporary research there is that challenges previous findings, that just outright negates or nullifies old ideas. But every now and then, you just look for where the newest ideas were in terms of these connections or these conversations, and you're still brought back a whole century.
Absolutely. And McCallum's paper was written in 1926, but he was writing about people who were in the 1800s. And I will mention we are going to also cite and deconstruct a modern version of this paper as well. We do have a modern research that parallels this 1926 paper, but still, with that being said, even think about what I was talking about with Quentin. This idea that you can replace blood with seawater. Do we understand now that that is not clear cut and that doesn't work in the way that he was thinking that it did? Of course. But I don't think that you can blame someone for trying. I still think that it's important to push forward with inquiry. And I think at that time he was onto something. It does bring up a lot of important questions about the composition of blood, health and disease, and the bigger question of interconnectivity between organisms. And so at that time, that made sense. But still, we have to keep pushing forward with the information that we have now, which is why, I made that comment about modern supplement companies and stuff, because sometimes people do capitalize on an attractive theory, an attractive way of thinking, especially about health and disease, even if, the modern answers point in a different direction. But all that being said, the inquiry is so important, and I really respect the line of inquiry.
And the funny thing is that in many ways we're having the same conversation even now. Because how have you been pronouncing it? Byung? Bung?
The author?
Yeah. The saltwater guy. Yeah,
Bunge.
Bunge. Yeah.
It has an E on the end, so that makes sense, right?
There might be some Germanic pronunciation that's like bunga or something like that,
Bunge.
or bunga.
Maybe
I
so.
don't know. I'll go with bunge, but just be consistent. Yeah. I just like
If that's wrong, that's going to be really embarrassing.
like one
Talk them out, Bunge.
yeah, one of our 30 listeners is going to be like, "Hey, that's not how you say bunge. You're ruining the academic integrity of this production." We lost him. We lost that one guy. But yeah, no. Bunge. Yeah, so again, if you even think about Bunge, in many ways, he's responding to the same thing. Again, this cultural narrative of ocean as mother, like this mother ocean kind of narrative. That still exists right now. Still, people kind of like have that same idea, that same calling projection in their own lives. This same guy was just testing it to the best of his ability just more than a century ago. And here we are still kind of asking pretty much the same questions, just with more data, information, research to compare it to.
And it even developed to be modern IV fluid. I mean, I'm sure that we wouldn't have gotten to the point where we would have modern IV fluid had it not been for the advances of people like Quentin. Because it wasn't just Quentin. In fact, I think there might have been a scientist before him that was looking into it. But still, all that being said, the idea of hydration and having electrolytes in there too, that is a really important component. And we see that within seawater, which is what we're trying to talk about today, because there's this whole connecting subject of salt. And like I had just mentioned before, salt has been very important to culture. Whenever Quentin was considering this, maybe it had to do a lot with narratives of like a mother sea figure, but then also a cultural need for salt. Like everyone craves salt. Literally, our taste buds have a whole channel of sensing this umami flavor, which is sensed deliciousness. And that comes specifically from the flavor of salt. So things like that, where it's clear that it's important to us as organisms. We've done lots of episodes on evolution. I do think it is important to remember that it takes a lot of energy input to develop an organism a certain type of way. And so if an organism does have a capability to sense some sort of molecule, like the umami flavor of salt, if we were created to have salt taste so delicious, it likely is for a reason. And so it does open up this very important line of inquiry. And I hope that that mentality is something that we can approach all of our work in, understanding that if something does interact within biology, it we can make the assumption that it's very likely for a reason.
I was just like, oh, it'd be cool to look up what are those salt tasting taste buds on the tongue, like what's that taste bud region. Well, instantly I started hitting articles, journalism pieces and stuff talking about how the exact taste bud networks of just how our tongue tastes salt is incredibly complicated. Apparently there are multiple salt pathways among the tongue for tasting different types of saltiness, like the tongue salt map.
And whenever you say different types of saltiness, do you mean different types of salt? Not just table salt, NaCl?
Yeah. We have two separate salt taste systems. One of them detects the attractive, relatively low levels of salt that make potato chips taste delicious. The other one registers high levels of salt, enough to make overly salty food offensive and deter overconsumption. There's a difference between pleasantly salty and then like overly salty, so it's just kind of like different levels of salinity.
Okay, so in McCallum's paper, there seems to be an intense connection with salt, blood, and culture. Are we truly constantly trying to return to the salty state of our marine ancestors? McCallum compares these previous theories to experimental evidence and finds that these historical theories could be further developed. The first claim that he makes: there are 4 inorganic compounds that are consistently found in all living organisms: sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. These are all positive cations and are found usually neutralized or bound to negative chloride, sulfate, phosphate, or carbonate. These produce various salt forms. Once again, we have table salt, NaCl, or general salts, which could be sodium chloride or magnesium sulfate, which is actually Epsom salt, or it could be calcium sulfate, which is called gypsum, etc. When it comes to the concentration of these inorganic compounds in seawater, McCallum explains the origin of this in the sea in a way that I just thought was super interesting, and I wanted to include it, truly asking the question, why is the sea so salty? He says, open quote, "The predominance of sodium in ocean water was the result of interaction of the negative elements for the possession of the bases and primal conditions on the Earth's surface. In this struggle, carbonic acid manifests a great affinity for sodium and silicic acid for potassium." End quote. He discusses how the erosion of silicate rocks, which make up the Earth's crust and is another way to say sand, how the erosion of this frees sodium in decomposition, producing sodium chloride in the sea, with the combination of chlorides of the alkaline earth. And then the carbonates of calcium and magnesium are deposited to form limestone and chalks. Potassium is sequestered in the ocean as siliceous rocks. So potassium is not in solution of ocean water, but on the ocean floor. It's also for this reason why plants are high in potassium, but low in sodium. Low sodium and high potassium of plants contrasts to humans, which are high in sodium and low in potassium. What was perplexing at this time was why the vertebrate, namely the human body, would evolve away from the sea and still maintain this intense desire for salt. Meanwhile, potassium, another essential inorganic molecule of living organisms, can be found in environments that are seemingly stripped of it because they're sequestered in plants. This was the potential inconsistency of the historical theories from Quinton and Bunge.
So again, it is natural for there to be scarce, crucial nutrients in any system. Again, there will always be, or there's usually a limiting factor, a bottleneck, something that all the organisms within a system are competing for. For example, you might be in a forest where nitrogen is a very scarce resource, and nitrogen being the basis of all protein is an incredibly important nutrient. If you have a system where there's low nitrogen, you'll still see organisms accumulating more than's available in the soil or the common resource bank, wherever that might be. But that's because it is so crucial, they have to go through the effort, the expending of energy to collect it. So again, if you look at things from a modern perspective, it's not out of the ordinary to see a discrepancy between natural concentrations in the world and then how much is being accumulated within an organism.
Even if one thing is abundant or scarce, I think it really matters whether it's in solution or not in solution. So, what I just talked about with the ocean, potassium and sodium are pretty abundant. But if we're talking about ocean water, what's actually in solution of the water, sodium is, but potassium is rather sequestered in rocks that sit at the ocean floor. It brings up a really interesting, you know, relationship there. There are mechanisms in which organisms can still acquire the important nutrients whether or not they're scarce. But I think in this vein, it does make sense why plants would be high in potassium if they're touching like rainwater runoff that got on limestone rocks and whatnot, rather than having all of the water that they interact with coming from the sea.
Yeah, I think I see where you're coming from there. So maybe we could put it this way. For any resource, nutrient, whatever is in need, there's what I was talking about before, like this idea of inherent scarcity or however scarce it is to begin with. But then I think that's introducing another concept of accessibility, where we could talk about how much there is, within the system, regardless of whether you're able to access it or not. And then that question of what you're leading into of can't be accessed. Because again, if you do want to think about it from a lens of scarcity, it's like, no, there's plenty of potassium. There's an insane amount of it in the ocean. It just can't be filtered out of the water. It has to be pulled out of the rocks. The other factor of that too is just, you think about the ability of a plant to physically break down the mineral composition of the soil that they're in too, which is honestly one of the coolest parts of plant ecology too, just looking at mineralogy and plant interaction, how like the acidic and chemical compounds of plant roots are able to break down minerals in order to get these electrolytes, minerals, nutrients that are locked away in the earth. That's how wheat has a high iron concentration. How the hell did this metal get into my grains? It's because that wheat still needs iron to a certain degree, is able to get it from the iron that exists in the soil, and then accumulates it within its organism. It feeds into accessibility. The ability to access a resource that other things cannot access can eventually lead for it to be abundant within the system in a way that deviates from the natural abundance in whatever nutrient resource landscape there is.
Just a little fun fact that reminded me of that. One of my favorite plants ever, horsetail, which is an ancient plant. I really like ancient plants because I feel like they just have more powers. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like they have more capability to adapt. And what you were just saying, what that means, it's making something accessible. And in doing that, it's almost pulling something out of the environment that was in such a small amount and you make it into such a big amount. The word that comes to mind, and I don't mean this in the magical type of way, I want to do a whole episode on this, but alchemy, to me, it's almost like alchemy. It's like creating something from nothing because you're pulling, such a scarce amount from your environment. But all that being said, I love horsetail and it's very high in silica. Like, I'm pretty sure some people even like blend it up and drink it as a smoothie because it's super high in silica. But one thing that I think is so cool about it, it's very adept at sequestering minerals from the soil. And I mean, this is sort of, I don't know if this is an old wives' tale. I've heard this verbally, but I've heard a story even that some people have pulled up horsetail that has been there for a long time, and in the roots, it's like nuggets of gold because it just draws up everything. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. And I'm hoping our listeners do too. And again, just to
Yeah.
build on all this, just for all of our lovely 30 listeners, if any of you want to go down the same rabbit hole, the best definition or word that captures this whole phenomenon is bioaccumulation, which just refers to more the natural setting, the tendency for organisms to accumulate or build up nutrients, whether because they're needed or just as like a metabolic byproduct from their environment.
We need to do an episode on that.
Yeah.
We need to do a bioaccumulation.
Yeah, bioaccumulation.
Episode.
But the other big one is bioremediation, which I feel like we could go insane on. And bioremediation, I'm looking at the Wikipedia right now. It's a beautiful little Wikipedia page. Is the specific phenomenon of using organisms, usually like algae, bacteria, or plants, to pull usually like human pollutants out of the environment, whether it be air, soil. I mean, I've heard of cases where like mustard greens have been used to pull like heavy toxic metals out of the soil with higher efficiency than like most, technologically advanced attempts humans have made.
Teaser for our bioaggregation
Woo!
episode.
Putting that in the master planning doc.
Yeah.
Bioaggregation.
What we just discussed was McCallum's assessment of the previous research around the connection between seawater and blood. And I talked about the question of why would humans evolve away from the sea if salty water was so essential to our being? In McCallum's research, he also states that the internal environment of the modern cell is distinctly different from its current external environment. In this case, the external environment would be blood plasma and lymph. And within the cell, potassium has a much higher concentration than sodium, and magnesium is higher than calcium. Conversely, in the plasma, aka the external cellular environment, sodium greatly exceeds potassium. He argues that because the internal cellular environment has been more preserved than the external, it is a more accurate artifact of the inorganic concentrations. So instead of looking at blood and bodily fluids to determine the ancient environment, we should be looking within the cell. And we see that within the cell, there is more potassium than sodium. One interesting aspect of this paper is the exploration of the changes in cellular sodium and potassium with the development of cell membranes. Of course, in the history of cellular evolution, protocells did not have nuclei and originally lacked membranes that would maintain a separation of the internal concentration versus the external. On this, McCallum writes, open quote, "The contents of the normal cell nucleus, as the author has found, does not know the inorganic world. It contains not a trace of potassium or of chloride phosphates, carbonates, or sulfates, and accordingly, no sodium, calcium, or magnesium, although these four elements are found in the cytoplasm. As this is true of the nucleus of the vegetable as of the animal cell, it must have developed before the differentiation into the two cell types began." End quote. Here, McCallum is talking about how the absence of these inorganic elements, namely sodium, magnesium, and potassium, meant that the nucleus was a sanctuary to protect the chromatin, the heredity controlling factor, from being in the slightest degree affected by the salts in the cytoplasm. But we still have this lingering question of, is seawater and blood/cytoplasm actually similar? If it was so similar that humans would need to spend their entire lives acquiring salt, what would be the benefit of evolving away from marine environments?
How roundabout would that be of just to stick with this theory that we have this, saltwater basis to our blood, looking at not all the same nutrients being in there, but the composition and concentration, or like, not that there's some nutrients that are just absent or present, but just that the concentrations are just completely different to the point where it's clear the body will have to heavily metabolize to maintain this. What's the point of our body going through all this metabolic effort to create a blood fluid basis or just a liquid basis to our bodies that is so strongly against the environment of the ocean that we'd have to go back and again say, actually, we need more salt anyway? Like, it feels like if we were to stick to that theory, our body would just be working in a strange direction.
One really interesting thing to me about this research is it does sort of prove what we were talking about with bioaggregation, in which that is something that biology always does. And in this case, we're making the claim that in the cells, there is aggregates of the compounds that were in the environment in the ancient world.
Mm-hmm.
But like you were saying, it opens up this really confusing question of, well, then why would we evolve away from it if it's something that we so clearly need and depend on? And so McCallum's paper poses this question, sort of refutes the previous literature, and tries to develop it in a way where we can come to a better answer of, is the history of humankind coming from the sea, evolving with salty water, and then moving away from the sea, or is it potentially something different? And this is where I would like to transition into a more modern paper.
Again, so just to cover that same ground, we're sticking with this discrepancy between the electrolyte concentration in the liquid in our bodies and the concentration in the ocean. It's a very clear difference. We're still just trying to figure out why. And again, just to touch back on this fact that like it is not irregular for life to create a concentration of minerals or nutrients different from the environment. It's just kind of inherent to life to just like, in order to maintain our own beings, we have to kind of create our own system that's something other than just, rock and dirt and running water. Like that's just inherent to life of just making your system other than the natural world. The question is, would some of the earliest life on Earth be able to so fundamentally create such a strong difference between itself and its environment? Because again, if you're thinking about the first cells, when our cell cytoplasm that's fairly universal or has a very strong universal kind of blueprint to it, when it was first emerging, would it be able to create something fundamentally different from its environment? Or would it just be doing whatever it could just to create a cell that can contain DNA without actively just falling apart or being destroyed by its environment? Like, I feel like that's where they're kind of coming from. It feels like, why would some of the first cells on Earth go through such trouble to accumulate a nutrient that is clearly so much more than one actually wants?
That's sort of the golden question. I will say, though, it is a fair assumption that the first cells did not have the capabilities to have membranes that could separate and distinguish the inner environment from the outer environment. And so that is one important thing. Our modern cells and the cells that we have now in all of our bodies, they have pumps and they have certain ion transporters that can basically allow the concentration to go against the electrochemical gradient, to whereas protocells did not have that capability. And that's sort of the foundation in which this theory is built on. And it does make sense, because if the cell could not separate the inner and outer environment, then can't we look at the inner environment now and take it as an artifact of the ancient world? And to me, that does make sense. I'll also say that another supporting, piece of evidence to go with that, McCallum just explained how in the nucleus now, there's no trace of inorganic compounds, which means that the nucleus acts as a protector against that environment. There was a time where cells did not have a nucleus. There was a time where the nucleus had not developed yet. UV rays and inorganic compounds, these things can all be damaging to the DNA, which is what is in the nucleus. That is what the nucleus protects. It does make sense that at that time, inorganic compounds, salts, the external environment did come in contact with the genetic material before nuclei developed, because at that time, organisms were single-celled. And so they might have replicated quickly and had a short lifespan. Whereas now we have long lifespans, we have tissues, we are multicellular organisms. So there can be profound effects if there is significant damage to the DNA. I believe, and I could be wrong, I'm going to look into this, but I believe that the damage would not nearly be as significant for single-celled organisms like the first cells. McCallum's paper helps us understand this well, but it was also written in the 1920s. So we want to find a more recent paper that has a more updated approach on understanding life's relationship to the ocean and to salt. Our paper is titled Origin of First Cells at Terrestrial Anoxic Geothermal Fields by Armin Molkidjenyan and colleagues in 2012. They argue that the modern cell's internal ion composition, which is high in potassium, phosphate, and transition metals, reflects the conditions in which protocells evolved. This is because, as mentioned earlier, protocells lacked ion-tight membranes and pumps, forcing their internal environment to maintain equilibrium from their external environment. Because of the high potassium to sodium ratio of cells, contrasting to oceans or lakes, these authors propose that the first cells originated not in oceans, but terrestrial anoxic geothermal fields that were high in potassium. And to visualize this, a terrestrial anoxic geothermal field could have been a shallow pond of condensed and cooled geothermal vapor, lines with silicate rocks, or in volcanic systems.
My first reaction just to even that like proposal of just maybe it's geothermal fields, not the ocean when the first cells arise. I just really love that idea just because I feel like I like seeing things taken for granted, just kind of like things that have just been constantly reiterated break apart more than anything. Because like I don't even have anything against the ocean as source of life narrative, but it is just so culturally entrenched and almost taken for granted. Not even on like like a gravity is real kind of thing. It's like one of those things that people like to call like, no, this is true. Like I feel it in my heart. Like this is one of those things that like people have a very strong emotional connection to. And so there's something very engaging to me about research saying like, no, what if it's completely not that? Or just having reason to believe something else.
Like I said in the beginning, I think that that is the most important thing with inquiry. It's sort of having the bravery to challenge new things because all we're doing, like I said, is building this domino train of thought. And one, like a domino at the beginning could be wrong and we could have to rewrite everything. But I think challenging and creating new theories based on the most consistent evidence and the most up to date evidence is exactly the best thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to mention that based on what we just said, one interesting sort of contrast is the fact that even in the human body right now, your internal cellular environment is very different from like your blood
Mm-hmm.
and your bodily fluids. That is really interesting. Like there even is a chemical gradient, electrochemical gradient being maintained within your own tissues. Like not even your cells and then things that aren't even in your body, but within your own tissues, there is this distinction being made.
The ways that I am kind of just engaging with this idea right now, and even if I'm not taking it to heart, the potential implications for it that I really love is just again thinking about kind of like this very simple evolutionary narrative that we're given of this crawl out of the ocean where you look at those like classic scientific diagrams where it's just like life comes from the ocean, slowly crawls on land, goes from fish to fish reptile thing to monkey to man. There's this idea that it's just like a simple linear lineage where you have this exponential growth of like as life continues, it becomes more advanced. And there's something very it's a very clean, linear, satisfying narrative. But looking at this hypothetical instead of life beginning in a thermal field, we have this back and forth of starts in a thermal field, somehow makes its way across drier, less thermal field comparable land, makes its way to the ocean, diversifies there, then comes back onto land, and then we even, to make something that looks like us. But then even after that, we have mammals going back into the ocean in the form of like whales and dolphins. We have this constant just back and forth, almost this indecisiveness of just life not sure where it's supposed to go, but still diversifying wherever it does. That feels, just which story just feels kind of like more true on just like a personal level, like this idea of life as like a clean, straightforward, from simple to advanced, or just an indecisive back and forth that's just all over the place. It feels a lot more playful to me.
I do see it as like kind of a living conversation because I would feel that way if the environment was staying the same too.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, the environment has changed so much. And so I think that we are always following the best possible, like sort of we were talking about aggregation of the environment and sequestering that within us. I think we are always trying to adapt to what the environment's giving us. And the environment has changed so much. I mean, this is another episode, but like even in college, one thing that Oliver and I had so many units on was the Carboniferous era, where there were ginormous arborescent plants that had insane rates of photosynthesis, like over 10,000 times any tree that we have today. And that's where coal came about because it was sequestering so much carbon and all this stuff. Like the world has been so different. The world had so much more oxygen back then. Insects were ginormous.
We had dinosaurs
and we're
for a
just
while.
trying to figure it out.
Yeah, there's the whole
Yeah,
dinosaur thing
I
that
still don't
happened.
understand what happened to dinosaurs.
The meteorite.
I still don't get that.
What do you not get?
Were dinosaurs just in one little area where the meteor hit?
No, it just
Like, surely they were widespread.
Yeah, no, they were widespread, but there was like a nuclear fallout after the whole meteorite because it was so big of just kind of like all like the ash and just dust that it kicked up was enough to block out the sun for like years. So then like all the plants died, and so like photosynthesis stopped. Like all the things that ate plants died. All the things that ate the things that ate plants died. And so I think that's the theory of just like how do we have chickens and like some survivals of dinosaurs? It's just the ones that were able to, the scientific term is thug it out. Like those that were able to make it through a, basically just like a global decades long famine. But one of the theories I remember hearing, I think in my evolutionary biology class, is maybe the survivors were detritivores. The things that already in the wild ate just kind of like were scavengers that ate kind of rotting flesh or kind of like rotten vegetation. Like after the fallout, they had plenty to eat when nothing else did. So that could be where reptiles and birds, kind of like the modern survivors of dinosaurs, came from. And all the little like rodents and mammal-y things that became us. Do not quote me on that, though.
Yeah, quote you on it.
Quote me on dinosaurs went bye-bye.
All right, moving on. So thinking about the distinction, even the difference between the intracellular environment and then the environment within blood and plasma. This did remind me of the role of potassium in regulating blood pressure, right? Because we always talk about sodium. In this whole conversation, we've been talking about the role of sodium in human lives. At the beginning, we were talking about the craving for salt, how that's affected modern people. But now that we have this narrative that actually maybe life evolved with a lot more potassium and a lot less sodium, I want to really reopen the conversation of blood pressure, but think about it from the perspective of potassium. Isn't that an interesting question? Like, now that I have this information that potassium was so much more important for our evolution than sodium, then it really makes me rethink, why isn't potassium culturally, significant in the same way that salt is? Especially with, now we know that there is a need to supplement sodium, NaCl, from the external environment. But now that we know that our cells were higher in potassium, and maybe therefore the original environment was higher in potassium, maybe potassium would be better supplementation, or even magnesium, because we talked about magnesium being higher. We know that despite this narrative of the human need for salt, overconsumption of salt leads to high blood pressure. So I did go down a little rabbit hole. I didn't include this in the docket of papers that we review, but I found a paper called Sodium, Potassium, and Blood Pressure, written by Myron Weinberger and published in the American Journal of Hypertension in 1997. It states, firstly, that blood pressure response to sodium is not universal, and there are many genetic factors at play. It does state that geographically, communities that consume high sodium usually tend to consume low potassium, while communities with high potassium consumption usually consume low sodium. So it seems like, firstly, there's one or the other in terms of cultural intake of either sodium or potassium. But going back to that statement of the response to sodium not being universal and being very variable, what we do know is people who have high blood pressure, it's something that gets gradually worse as you get older. It's usually something that people struggle with later in their lives. And so I think that that's really interesting because our bodies do regulate the amount of salt that is within our blood. That's one, constant variable that our body tries to maintain. And so even if you have one salty meal one day, your body will try to maintain that equilibrium through regulation of kidneys, urine. And so it's going to maintain that constant. But over time, these systems start to get leaky if you're bombarding your body constantly with an overconsumption of something. We talked about that in our insulin episode. You can develop type 2 diabetes because you have this lack of response to whatever compound you're talking about. In that case, it was sugar. In this case, it's salt. Over time, that regulation system starts to get leaky. And so that's why it's something that people struggle with in older age. It's because it takes time for it to manifest in a way that's severe. But in the Western world, we do know that we overconsume salt, especially in the United States. we do know that sodium increases blood pressure. Going back to sodium and potassium consumption, communities that have high potassium, low sodium, and then high sodium and low potassium. This makes sense with the high potassium concentration in fruits and vegetables. On the other hand, there's high sodium content found in animal meat, showing a relationship between sodium and potassium consumption in meat eating communities versus vegetarian societies. And this paper also states that potassium supplementation was shown to decrease blood pressure, while it's known that sodium increases blood pressure. And so I just thought this was so interesting, the way that it fit into the narrative of this human craving for salt, this human need for salt, this misplaced, maybe not misplaced, but likely misplaced idea that humans evolved from the sea and therefore need to maintain the salty environment. Whenever the case may be, humans evolved from a very high potassium environment, and maybe having more balance with potassium intake and potassium sodium exchange could actually reverse some of the major statistics that we're seeing with blood pressure.
When we're talking about salt and the need for salt, do we really know what we're talking about? If you look at that like paradoxical relationship, we crave salt, but we have too much, but we know we need it. What's going on? Like, why is there a discrepancy between what we're craving and how we're responding to it? It feels like it could just be that there's almost this kind of like, in terms of the data and like our evolutionary cell basis, like the elephant in the room that is potassium, maybe like that craving, we have been calling it a need for sodium because of just, the cultural narrative and like our common understanding has been electrolyte, salt, we need salt. But maybe this whole time that craving has been potassium and we just didn't realize it because we have been stuck in that notion of, oh, it has to be salt.
I completely agree. And I do want to say this is not medical advice. I'm not telling people to start taking high amounts of potassium. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is this is a very interesting research avenue. I would like to see more research on this. I would like to see more investment go into this, especially now that we know that it could potentially be linked to the cellular evolution of our bodies. To me, I'm not saying that everything ancient is medicine. That's not what I'm saying. But it would be interesting to understand the role of potassium in our modern lives if we know that it was likely something that allowed for balance for our ancestors. That's all I'm saying. I would like to see more research around this topic. That was just a linear flow that my brain went to because we were talking about sodium. And then, this was a huge unknown to me that actually sodium was low and potassium was high in our bodies, because I thought with this whole conversation of sodium cravings, surely sodium must be high and therefore very important. But actually, now that I see that it's the flip side, I immediately went to blood pressure because that's what I think about whenever I think about sodium consumption. But there's something else that I think about too, and that was my second sort of mental leap if we're talking about intellectual play with these topics. And my second mental leap was talking about conductivity of cells. So what do I mean whenever I say that? Neurons and muscles are the types of cells that have action potentials. Action potentials are basically like electrical impulses that send signals in our body, whether it's to create memories, have these neuronal pathways, or to move our bodies in a muscular way. And if you've taken any sort of physiology class, you know that potassium and sodium are two essential compounds whenever it comes to the conductivity of our cells. And I wish that I could develop the conductivity idea more. It was something that I wanted to emphasize more in this episode, just because if we're talking about the difference between water and salt water has more electrolytes, and electrolytes have more conductivity. There's more potential for electrical interaction, carrying of currents, and things like that. So I wish that I could elaborate on it more and elaborate on the way that our blood conducts, or has the capability to conduct electrical impulses, if it even does. I have no idea. Like, I've never looked into that topic. But I couldn't find a ton on that. But it's okay because there's so much to talk about just in terms of the conductivity of action potentials and how that is impacted by sodium and potassium. So, like I said, we have different types of cells in our bodies that are specialized to do many different types of things. Muscle cells and neurons are the only cell types that generate action potential, a fast and moving change of membrane potential in the cell to therefore propagate a signal, an electrical impulse, and therefore a response. In vertebrates like humans, the entire capability of action potentials to propagate is based on high potassium concentration in the cell, an influx of sodium and calcium that depolarizes the cell. That's actually what creates the action potential. This depolarization allows for signal propagation. But of course, whenever I made that connection of animal cells being able to propagate action potentials because they have high potassium inside of their cells, my next thought was because we are aware that the evolution with animals and plants were different as it relates to access to sodium and potassium, because, like we said at the beginning, plants were in an environment that had very high potassium, and plants are a source of potassium. To whereas whenever you eat animal meat, it is a source of salt. The concentration of sodium and potassium within animal cells is different than that within animal blood and bodily fluid. In the McCallum paper, we discussed how we were going to use the intracellular environment to determine the ancient environment where animals evolved, because the intracellular environment was what was closed off and therefore protected. Inside of the cell is what we could use as an artifact. It is likely that the bodily fluid composition changed over time, but we, I think, are making the assumption with this research that it is less likely that the intracellular environment changed as much. And so, with that, we know that human bodily fluid is high in salt, although the intracellular environment is higher in potassium. But that is very different than that of plants. Plants are a good source of potassium, while animal meats are a good source of salt. And so my first thought there was, if potassium and salt play such a large role in the conductivity of cells and the propagation of action potentials, then what is the difference between animals and plants, if there is one? What role does having high potassium or having high sodium in evolution play with how we have action potentials, which leads to ability to create memories, ability to move our bodies, and ability to respond to our environment? How is that different? So, what I didn't know is that plants also have action potentials. Because keep in mind, in animals, it's only the neurons and the muscles that are able to produce action potentials. But actually, plants do have action potentials. For example, Oliver has a ton of carnivorous plants, like the Venus flytrap, and they close their mouths using action potential. Immediately, I thought about whether the charge gradient held by ions in plants would be different than in humans, considering that we know that plants are high in potassium and low in sodium, while humans are low in potassium and high in sodium. Keep in mind, we're talking about bodily fluid rather than the intracellular environment. Although the exact mechanisms are not known, we know that the action potential of the Venus flytrap plant is not due to influx of sodium or calcium like in animals. Oliver, do you have any initial thoughts on that? Like, do you kind of understand what I'm saying? I know that that was like a wild
No,
ride
I was going to let you play out a little
to get
bit more
there.
because I'm still trying to make the same connections the way you are.
So ultimately, in animals, the action potential is propagated by a sodium potassium ATPase pump. To whereas in plants, it does not have to do with sodium potassium at all. It has to do with a hydrogen ATPase pump. To me, that's really interesting because it shows that if life's role is to separate the environment with the self, to therefore aggregate important molecules and separate them to create this gradient that they can then use that gradient for as energy, then I just found it really interesting that plants did not rely on sodium and potassium at all, to whereas humans that's completely how it's made. To me, that shows that humans are a lot more sensitive to sodium and potassium than plants are. I could be wrong about that. That could be a false conclusion to come to, but that's my first thought, that the role of potassium and sodium in the environment for animals is essential, whereas with plants, that is not the essential molecules. Even the resting potential of the cells. In animals, this is regulated by potassium alone, through potassium leaking and high potassium concentration within the cell, whereas in plants, it's more maintained by hydrogen. The depolarization of an action potential in animal cells occurs with sodium influx, whereas in plants, it occurs with calcium influx. That being said, though, I will add that action potentials of animals are very rapid, and then action potentials of plants are much slower.
Yeah.
That's it. That's really all I have to say.
Yeah, so one of my interpretations of that is that you almost kind of want to use action potentials as a way to illustrate how fundamental our relationship with sodium and potassium is. It's just kind of oh yeah, it's so baked into just how our bodies function, how signals are transmitted throughout all of our tissues. Surely this could kind of speak to why it plays such a crucial role in your body. But instead you look at plants, you can achieve a similar function with hydrogen and calcium instead. Again, maybe the answer there is that the what's the word for the action potential. It's maybe the explanation for that is the plant model for the action potential just does not move quickly enough for animal life. Even for Venus flytraps, which are some of the quickest moving action potentials or some of the most advanced movements in plants, those still take a good second to just kind of close up in response to stimulus. They're still not moving that fast. So maybe the answer there is just different action potentials for different purposes. But I think it does kind of speak to, or just does further complicate a place where you're looking for an explanation of why we have such a strong relationship with sodium and potassium specifically, as opposed to all the other elements, nutrients, electrolytes in the world.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why I was looking into it too in the first place was if we had this idea that our environment was once higher in potassium and potentially we are under consuming potassium based on what would be optimal for our bodies. If that is the foundational assumption, then I did want to know what effects that could have on action potential. Like, say that people consumed more potassium. Would that be good for action potential? Would that be bad? And so I did look into it and it it depends on obviously how much potassium you're intaking. It can be bad. Absolutely it can be bad. It can also be bad to intake too much sodium though too. And that's what we're seeing with blood pressure. And so I think that that's why I looked into it in the first place. And of course, if having a high intracellular potassium concentration is so important, then I wanted to understand, is that disrupted or is that strengthened if you increase the amount of potassium that's in the blood as well? If that makes sense. If you think about what an action potential is, I know I keep going back to it, but the reason why is as a concept, I think that it's really important. The entire action potential relies on an electrochemical gradient, which is the separation and potential energy of these ions. And so that is only made whenever there's clear curation of where the ions are. Is it in the cell? Is it outside of the cell? And how much for both environments? And so that's why I was looking into it, because if the protocell was not able to separate or regulate these ions and environments, then how did they function? And in my mind, at first, I was like, how do you function without action potentials? But then I realized that I was probably looking at it the wrong way, because you don't need action potentials, especially if you're not a multicellular organism. You can just vibe.
Yeah, I mean, what all do action potentials do? That's kind of what I'm trying to remember. Isn't that kind of the basis for a lot of our nervous system?
Yeah, so it's nerves and muscles.
Nerves and muscles, yeah. Yeah.
Mhm. And then I think some endocrine organs could somehow either respond or create action potentials, but it's mainly the nervous system and the muscles.
Yeah, so for human beings with highly developed brains, pretty important. But if you're just well, not just a plant, I'm not gonna act like we're more advanced than plants just because they don't have nervous systems the way we do. But if you are trying to live the life of a plant that doesn't need reaction times like this, or it's not worthwhile to develop these same action potentials just due to the resource intensivity or just requirements of it, yeah, it's not the end of the world if you don't got any. A lot of this just speaks to the complexity of our relationship with desire, or also just like the complexity of having a body, of just we are at the mercy of these systems requirements that are so beyond our own understanding, but are absolutely crucial to our own functioning, survival, ability to live long term. Like, there are very few people in the world thinking about whether they're getting the necessary sodium, potassium, nutrients on a daily basis based off foods. Well, more people now, but even still, just thinking historically on a large scale, people aren't always thinking about the exact nutrient breakdown of their foods and how much is going into their system. But at the end of the day, it just deeply determines our ability to live, function, be healthy. That's what's hitting me a little bit, of just realizing, wow, so much of my life can be at the mercy of a nutrient that I just don't even think of outside of bananas. So it does kind of like humble me, or I don't know. Again, I think it just speaks to how hard it is just to do the right things, to be healthy, to give your body what it needs. I guess softens my own relationship with trying to do all the right things.
Yeah. I also thought it was so wild how in the historical papers that we read, people would choose salt over food and water.
Mm.
Like, salt was more essential than food. People would starve and they would use all of their money buying salt. And to me, it was interesting that it like offered so much nutrition. I feel like there's this secret side of salt. I don't even know if we were able to touch on it in this episode. Even if it may be not historically accurate with the cellular evolution of humans, like it's clearly important, has a lot of important properties to the way that we're able to
Hmm.
function. Like, not just in regulating blood pressure. That's sort of what I was trying to get at the end of the discussion, that it does have, significant roles in how we're able to function cognitively as
Hmm.
well. Like, the conductivity of our bodies.
I'm almost thinking about just kind of like the human cultural valuing or obsession with meat. Even again, thinking of historically as something that has been more scarce than it has been in common for human diets throughout time. Maybe you could even say just like, why do people have this craving for meat, or this like cultural culinary obsession with it? Maybe it was about salt the whole time, you know? Again, because even thinking about sugar,
Yeah.
like saying to, a European medieval serf like several hundred centuries ago, saying, oh, one day you'll have too many calories, and that'll be the problem that kills more people in our country than starvation. They'd be like, what the hell are you? No, I'm not going to try and do a little Cockney surf accent. He'd be like, what are you talking about? It's like, how could that be a problem? And I'm like, maybe it's the inverse thing of just kind of like we are in a weird boat where what throughout most of human history has been, worth its weight in gold.
Also, just weird fun fact, iodized salt. I learned this year in grad school, actually. Iodized salt is something that we add to salt. Like, it is not naturally found with salt.
Yeah.
And at first, I just thought that it was like a weird preservative. I didn't know why we had it. I always bought non-iodized salt or like sea salt. But the reason why we do that is iodine is an essential building block of thyroid hormone,
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of hard to get through your diet. Like, it's kind of rare in nature. It's hard to get through your diet. So the United States and other countries fortify their salt with iodine so that people can have adequate amounts of iodine to produce thyroid hormone, which is why people who stop using iodized salt and only use like Celtic sea salt thinking that it's healthier, like, you're more likely to develop thyroid disease in the future. And whenever I say more likely, it's not even just a genetic thing. If you do not have iodine, you will develop hypothyroidism. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take. Is it going to take 6 months? I don't know. It's not immediate. It takes months because your body sequesters iodine so much. But that is why we have iodized salt. That's a little interesting tidbit for you. I think all in all, what this conversation has showed us is that there is this mysterious connection between blood, the salt that is in our blood, the salt that is in our sea, and the salt that is in our cells. And I think that that connection remains mysterious. I appreciate the fact that it's a mystery, and I hope to learn more about it later on, especially the conductivity part. But one thing that I took away from this conversation that I really did not know before, and I know it might sound trivial, but I truly think it's very interesting, is the fact that potassium might play a much bigger role in the evolution of human cells and health and disease of the human body than sodium. To me, that's a very interesting door that's being opened. I would like to see a lot more research around potassium. I want to see what health benefits could come from increased potassium. I'm not saying that there will be. Like, I'm not telling people to go out and buy potassium supplements. I'm just saying it could be a really interesting research avenue. Although, like I said, the salt aspect of ourselves is kind of a mystery. I do think that now we have another mystery, and that's potassium. I'm really excited to learn more about it. I think that it's sort of a secret leader in our bodies. It's clear that it is the main player in action potentials. It is the main player in, or it could be a player in regulating blood pressure as well. And so I'm excited to see what role potassium does play in our bodies now that we know its relevance to our cellular evolution.
All right, everyone. That was episode 6, Salt, Blood, Conductivity, Culture. We hope that you thoroughly enjoyed sitting in alongside our conversation. If you had any questions or comments or would like to reach out, you can do so at media@octorum.com. Please leave a review if you feel so inclined. If it is anything less than 5 stars, I will personally hunt you down. But I appreciate honesty at the same time. I am not kidding. Is there anything else I should say to the common Joes and Josephines that listen to Octorum?
If you enjoy it, please share with your friends and please let us know. That's all I ask.
And follow us on Instagram at Octorum_podcast.